Good morning. Thank y'all for being here today. It's my honor to share Memorial Day with you, especially our veterans, those on active duty, and their families. We're blessed to have the Veterans Memorial in such a prominent location. It keeps our daily thoughts, the reality of the sacrifices so many have made for us and our nation. Let me again thank the Hurecki family and others who 7 years ago built this memorial outside and donated it to the residents of Friendswood. We are grateful for your contribution. I want to thank my colleagues on City Council for their contribution to leading us forward. We've got Jim Hill here, Mayor Pro Tem, Steve Rocky, newly elected Sally Branson, Carl Gustafson, past City Council member Billy Enox. I believe I saw past City Councilman Pat McGinnis. Judge Mark Henry, and I think that's about it. Our honored guests today are veterans and active military members and their families. We begin with the greatest generation. At the time, they were young men, young people, who answered the call to the Pacific or Europe or elsewhere during World War II. We honor them and their families by asking them to stand or just wave if you're able to be recognized so that Friendswood may thank you once more. We include those who braved the extremes of Korea, the jungles of Vietnam, or served anywhere else between the end of World War II and 9/11. Would you and your family stand or raise your hand so that we may thank you once more? Wow. Since 9/11, wars have been fought a different way. Today, we have members of the armed forces spread around the world and within our borders, no matter where they are stationed. It is a sacrifice for the men and women of our military and their families. If you or a family member has served since 9/11, would you stand so we may thank you? It's a great honor to do this. Today, we honor all who have served and their families, especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice to maintain our liberty. This memorial outside is a reflection. As we look at it, we can see the reflection of many people. We see the reflection of our proud history, of our diversity, and of our moral character. Today, as we come together from many different backgrounds, we're all grateful Americans. We're grateful for all who have served in our military, past, present, and their families. God bless Friendswood, and God bless America. Now, if you would rise for a moment of prayer from Deacon Vince Eklund of Mary Queen Catholic Church and remain standing afterwards, please.
Good morning. So let us pray. Heavenly Father, as we gather today as a community and a nation, We remember those who have gone before us in service to our country, both civilians and fallen members of our armed forces. Their example of courage and sacrifice serves to remind us of the responsibility that we have to serve you, God. This morning, we turn to you, and we ask that you continue to bless our country and those who have given their lives in service to it, as well as their families who have also sacrificed. Please keep close to your heart our servicemen and women and provide strength and grace as they continue to defend and protect our country. Memorial Day is about coming together to honor those who gave their all. So we ask for your special blessings upon them and their families, and we ask this in your heavenly name. Amen.
Please remain standing for presentation of the colors, the national anthem, and the posting of the colors.
Color guard attention.
Color guard, again. Color guard, carry colors. Ready, peace. Forward, march. Ready, peace.
Color guard present arms.
Present. March.
Color guard order arms.
Order, march.
Post the colors.
Ready, peace. Post. Ready, peace.
Color guard post.
Post, march.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please be seated. And so by now, we've all met Gina Baker, who did that beautiful presentation of the national anthem. Gina's a Friendswood High School graduate, and she's also a student at the University of Houston's Moore School of Music. So let's have a hand for Gina Baker. Well, it's my honor this morning to introduce. Hello, Stephen. It's my honor this morning to introduce our guest speaker, Colonel Terry Virts, United States Air Force, retired. Actually, I've known Terry for about 15 years. Met him when I was out on patrol as a patrolman, stopped him on traffic a few times. So I think he's probably, we weren't going to tell that story, were we, sir? In any event, Colonel Virts has quite a resume. Folks can go ahead and catch a very detailed version of it online, but just in the way of summary, Terry went ahead and actually attended on an exchange basis the French Air Force Academy, and did that while he was a student at the United States Air Force Academy. He graduated in 1989 and began his service as a second lieutenant and earned his pilot wings at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona in 1990. From there, Colonel Virts completed basic fighter and F-16 training and was assigned initially to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida as an F-16 pilot in the 307th Tactical Fighter Squadron. From 1992 to 1998, he served in a variety of operational F-16 squadrons where he logged 45 combat missions in the F-16. He completed Air Force Test Pilot School in 1998 and was an experimental test pilot until his selection as an astronaut in 2000. Colonel Virts is one of 4 astronauts to have ever piloted a space shuttle, fly on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft, performed spacewalks, and to command the International Space Station. Most recently, Colonel Virts is one of the stars of a new IMAX film entitled A Beautiful Planet, which was released in April of 2016. Colonel Virts' military decorations include the NASA Space Flight Medal, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Air Medal, the Aerial Achievement Medal, the NASA Exceptional Achievement Medal, and the Air Force Commendation Medal. Sir?
We have a saying in the Air Force that stories need to be at least 10% true, and I think Chief's story was at least 10% true. We did, in fact, meet at some time in the past, so that meets our that meets our criteria there. It's very honored today to be able to speak here in my hometown. I've been a Friendswood resident for 17 years, and as they say, I wasn't born here, but I got here as fast as I could. I'm proud this year my son's graduating from Friendswood High School after being a football player for the last few years and getting to go play at the Texan Stadium, which is pretty cool the last 2 years. Off to A&M to join the cult. So he's off there. When I think of Memorial Day, I always think of my grandparents. Grandfathers were in World War II in the Army and Navy, or you think of Vietnam vets. World War II veterans, we don't have that many left. You know, my grandparents are gone, and it's been a while since World War II ended. But this is kind of the traditional, what I think of growing up, Memorial Day celebrations. My generation is Iraq and Afghanistan. I know a lot of people here served in the last now 26, almost 27 years of continuous combat operations there. But this is a special year, and I thought of giving a talk about something a little bit different. It's the 100th anniversary of America's involvement in World War I. And our last World War I veteran passed away at the age of 110 in 2010. So there's no more World War I veterans left. But it's such an important part of war, of our history. It's something that we really don't think about much after we leave high school history class. So I thought I would talk about it. It was known at the time as the Great War. In fact, during World War II, they would talk about, oh, you were in the Great War. That was what it was called. It was also called the War to End All Wars, and boy, did they get that wrong. But the veterans that we sent over there to fight made such an impact on the 20th century. I think it's important to take a few minutes to talk about it. My grandfather had the most amazing basement when I was a little kid. He had toy trains and lots of antiques. He made his own root beer. He had a root beer machine in the basement. Back home in Maryland, they have things called basements. They were higher than 3 feet above sea level, so they don't flood that often. And one of the things he had down there was this old box of pictures. They were stereoscopic. It was like the original VR gear from World War I. It was a little device. You could hold it in front of your eyes, and you'd stick black and white cards of pictures in there. And when you look through, it was a 3D image. And he had this box of World War I images. And so I've always thought of these World War I images. They were terrible. They were black and white, sepia-colored men laying on barbed wire and gas warfare. They were really bad pictures, but it was the vision of World War I that I had, and that was kind of how people remembered the war for years. But life was very different back then. Before 1917 in America, I did some research on, what life was like. Women couldn't vote. More than half of Americans lived in rural environments, or most of them lived on the family farm. There was a 10% infant mortality rate. So think about that. Of all the kids that all of us have had, imagine if 10% of them had died before age 1. That was life for Americans 100 years ago. Less than 20% of the homes had stoves. Only 1 in 50 Americans had a car. And there were hardly any paved roads. So there was very few traffic stops back then. So that some things were good. Almost no Americans had traveled abroad, unless you were very wealthy and you'd go spend a month in Paris or something like that. I mean, most Americans hadn't left the state they were in. Even my own grandparents, if it weren't for World War II, just grew up and stayed in that little area for their entire lives. The 4G and Wi-Fi coverage was terrible. So life 100 years ago was a lot different than it is now. So how did this conflict of World War I start? What would cause seemingly rational and educated Europeans to start the most terrible war imaginable? And we all learned this story in high school history class, like I said, but it was a warm summer day in June of 1914. And the Austria-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Countess Sophie, were shopping in Sarajevo. And there was a lot of tension. There was a Serbian nationalist group that didn't appreciate Austria-Hungary kind of occupying their country. And so they planned on killing him. And while he was driving around in one of those old open cars, somebody threw a bomb at the car and it exploded, but it missed. And they sped off. And there was this young Serbian, a guy named Gavrilo Princip, who was sitting there. He was 19 years old. He had a gun in his jacket, and he wanted to kill the Archduke, but the bomb missed, and he drove away, and he thought it was over with. So he walked away kind of dejected. The Archduke was really mad. He said, "That guy's crazy," and he wanted to show, his fortitude. So they continued their shopping trip, and he told his driver, "Let's keep on going." And the driver took a wrong turn, went down an alleyway, and as he was making a U-turn in the car, Gavrilo Princip walked by and said, "Hey, there's Archduke Ferdinand." And he got out his gun and he shot him and killed the Archduke and the Countess. And within a week, all of Europe was at war or mobilizing for war. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Serbia's ally Russia declared war on them. Germany came to Austria's aid and declared war on Russia, and also added in France, and then actually attacked Belgium right away. When they attacked Belgium, England declared war on Germany, and within literally like a week, it happened very quickly, the allies of England and France and Italy and Russia were at war with the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And so what was just normal life all of a sudden became this amazing World War conflict brewing. At the time, all the men marched off to war. There were parades. The kids came out to wave flags. The women cried and said, "Come, we want you home by Christmas." This was in the summer of 1914. And everybody went off to war excited, thinking this was going to end quickly. It was an age of chivalry. And then the war began, and modern technology had caught up. It was not the 19th century cavalry anymore on horses. The machine gun had been developed. Tanks had been developed at the time. Gas warfare and chemical warfare had come along. The very first airplanes were there, and submarines. Also, the Germans had the Unterseeboot, or the U-boats. And so all these new machines of ways for people to kill other people had been invented. They had dug a 450-mile trench from the North Sea down to Switzerland, and that thing quickly became a shell-pocked moonscape of no man's land. The old military tactics that had worked in the past, one of the French marshals was Ferdinand Foch, and his mantra was attaquer, or attack. And that, in the World War I universe, they would send these waves of men over the trenches into the barbed wire and machine guns and gas, and the human flesh was no match for that new metal. Some examples of some of the battles there are Verdun was probably the most terrible battle maybe ever. It lasted for 300 days, from February to November of 1916, and over 300,000 people were killed. When I was based in Germany, one of my favorite things to do was to go drive around the countrysides and learn about history. Unfortunately, a lot of it is World War I and World War II history. And I remember I went to Verdun. I'd heard about it in school. I didn't know anything about it. And there's a giant, it's like a traditional European cathedral. It's an old school building, and it is long. I mean, it's like I don't know if it's a kilometer long, but it seemed like it. It's a big building. And so I walked up to it. I really didn't know what was there, and we were walking along. And there's the upstairs cathedral area, and then the downstairs there's these kind of half underground rooms that you can walk for 10 or 15 minutes. And I looked in one, and it was full of skeletons, and it shocked me. Like, I couldn't believe it. And there are the remains of 130,000 men in this giant thing that they don't know who's who there, because the battle was so terrible. There's it's kind of legendary. There's like these mounds of fields, and there are these bayonets sticking up through the dirt, and the men were sitting there ready to go when artillery came in and buried them alive. So that was Verdun. By the summer of 1916, they launched the Battle of the Sun. The Allies were trying to break the Germans and break this trench warfare. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 19,000 men were killed. And then ultimately that battle ended up in 1 million casualties. There was Gallipoli. There was a famous movie, I think back in the 80s. Over 100,000 people were killed there. While that carnage was forever changing Europe, and it really did, America was out of the war. We are blessed with two important things called the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so we were really wanting to stay out of this war. We saw what was going on. This was not what we wanted to be involved in. President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, had been reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Interestingly enough, Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president a few terms before that, was still in politics, and he was really prodding Wilson to get involved, seeing how terrible things were. And then this thing called unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans decided to, we were helping out the Allies with supplies, so the Germans decided to just have unrestricted sinking of boats. And these terrible death tolls came in. And then something happened between Germany and Mexico. There was this thing called the Zimmerman Note. In my family's name is Zimmerman, so I wonder if I had anything to do with this, the German foreign secretary. But they had written a telegram to Mexico, and it got decrypted. It's like the most famous, most impactful spy story of all time, this decryption of this intercepted transmission. But the Germans had said, "Hey, Mexico, if you get involved with America, we'll give you back Texas." That wasn't going to happen. And Arizona, New Mexico, but if you get involved and you keep America busy here, it was like a collusion between Germany and Mexico. And so when that got public, and you can read the note, it's pretty amazing to read like how brazen it is on the internet. We decided to get involved in the war. President Wilson went to Congress, asked for a declaration of war, and he said it's a fearful thing to lead this great, peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, but the right is more precious than the peace. He was met with tremendous raucous applause by Congress when he said those words. He went back to the White House and told his aide, "My message today was a message of death for our young men. How strange it is to applaud that." And then went to his bedroom and wept because he knew what was coming. So the U.S. entered the war, and even though we knew this was coming, like we knew there was war in Europe for several years, we were woefully unprepared. At the time, we had the 19th largest army in the world. We had 197 ships in our Navy. At the time, Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin Roosevelt increased that to 2,000 in just the span of just over a year. The troops had no weapons to train with. There's pictures of Army guys at basic training with like wooden guns, pretending to run around and shoot each other with wooden guns. And we had very few combat officers or NCOs to lead our troops. So we were like not ready for this. The first order of business was to find a man to lead the effort, and President Wilson selected John Blackjack Pershing. Women went off to work really for the first time in significant numbers. The troops were off and had left their jobs, and also America depended on immigration. In fact, we still depend on immigration. And those immigrants were not coming to jobs anymore, so women had to go out and work in the workplace. You always hear about the World War II women, but it really happened first in World War I. I did some research on Friendswood's impact of or from World War I, and there's a wonderful Friendswood Historical Society. Does anybody here volunteer with them? Yeah, I've been here 17 years, I'd never been there, but down the street there's a really cool museum, an old barber shop in the original Friendswood house, and I went down there and read some material and talked to the lady there. And Friendswood, of course, is based on the Friends Church or a Quaker church, and the men were conscientious objectors, and so they went off to do farm labor throughout the country. They were fig farmers, I learned at the time, and so they were very skilled at farming, but that's how they served. And also some actually went overseas. There was an organization called FAR, I think, and they did charity work for orphans. There was millions of orphans there, and also just medical help in the back lines. But I couldn't find any Friendswood dead from World War I, and I think the reason is they were conscientious objectors and did not go fight on the front lines. There were 370,000 African Americans served during that war. Most were in like labor types of jobs, but there were two combat divisions, and the most famous was the 93rd Harlem Hellfighters, and they really earned a significant reputation. Their most famous member was Henry Johnson, and his stories are amazing. If you get a chance to read about Henry Johnson, it's incredible. But he was never recognized for what he did until President Obama awarded him, or his family, the Medal of Honor just a few years ago. So life changed quickly in many ways for America from that war. We declared war on April 6th, but the American Expeditionary Force really wasn't in country ready to go for over a year. It was the summer of 1918, and the war was still a stalemate at that time. Germany knew we were coming, and they did some offenses. They wanted to try and get the war over with before we got there because they knew what would happen once we got there. But in July 1918, we began our first combat operation, the Saint-Mihiel Offensive. We pushed through the German lines, went all the way back to the Hindenburg Line. That was kind of their last defense. And when we got to the Hindenburg Line, winning the battle was one thing, but we did this massive 800,000 troop shift, logistical maneuver in the middle of battle, and that was something that really impressed our European allies and the Germans, because that kind of showed that even though we were these young colonists who didn't know what they were doing, that was the first time our army had really engaged in such a complicated way. And the German soldiers, I read several quotes of what they had written in their diaries, and basically they said once they had met American soldiers in the woods there, they knew that it was over because our fighters were pretty fierce. After that Saint-Mihiel offensive, we pursued the final Meuse-Argonne offensive, and that took the fight into Germany. It was so terrible. One of the American Sergeant Davies wrote in his journal that hell has no terrors for me after this, after the gas and the bayonets and the shelling. It was a pretty ugly fight, and finally, these American soldiers had tipped the scales. For 4 years. The Europeans had just killed each other in the trenches. When we got there, in just a few months, the war was over. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated on November 9th, and the armistice, as we all know, was finally signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And we call that Veterans Day. In Europe, they call it Remembrance Day or Armistice Day. I had the honor, when I was at the French Air Force Academy as a cadet, I got to march on Armistice Day on the Champs-Élysées. That was pretty cool to celebrate that. And years later, I got to fly F-16s in parades on that day, which was amazing. Something for Europe is really strikes home, but for Americans, it's something that we just don't think about, or I never did anyway, the impact that World War I had. The impact of that war was pretty amazing. Of course, in America, we had these big celebrations, kind of like you see the World War II pictures. We had a big celebration. We entered the Roaring 20s. It was kind of a big party decade in America. For Europe, it was different. They had lost an entire generation. The mid-20th century leaders had all fought in the war, been involved in some way in the war. Franklin Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Sergeant York, we've heard of Sergeant York, a young man named Adolf Hitler, Henry Truman, Ernest Hemingway, the list goes on. All the famous names from the 20th century, mid-20th century, had been involved in this great war. Diplomat and historian George Kennan termed it the great seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. And I believe it like permanently robbed Europe of an innocence and put them on a path to socialism. That war destroyed 4 empires. It created the rise of communism. The Bolsheviks and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin won the Russian Revolution and took over and created the Soviet Union a few years later. And we all know what that caused for the following 80 years. The battle tolls were terrible. America lost 116,000 people in what was essentially 4 months of fighting. It was interesting. Only half of those were from combat. Most of the rest were from the flu or other diseases that they got. But that was our losses. Russia lost 1.7 million people. Germany lost 1.6 million. France, 1.4 million. England, 700,000. So the losses then, a century ago in Europe, were just amazing. And something also that I didn't realize, that there was a global flu epidemic during that time that killed 50 million people around the world. Like an entire European country died from the flu during the World War I time. The Middle East got redrawn. Here's another impact. There's a map called Sykes-Picot. A Brit named Sykes and a Frenchman named Picot sat down with some rulers and drew straight lines across the desert. And whoever served in the last 25 years has been involved in those maps somehow. They still exist today. A lot of the news that we see on the nightly news is because of the maps that were drawn 100 years ago after World War I. That's a long-reaching impact. Another impact, President Wilson kind of took America into the world. We had been protected by these 2 oceans. He started a globalist policy and had the League of Nations, started the League of Nations, that ultimately the Senate did not pass. We had something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact that outlawed war. That didn't work so well either. But anyway, it was really a time of kind of coming out for America. And I think the most important thing that happened out of World War I is the Versailles Treaty had something called the War Guilt Clause. And Germany had to pay reparations. And there were these terrible debt that we put on Germany that was not payable. It led to several decades of economic disaster for Germany. And ultimately, there was this young Austrian corporal who had been wounded in the Great War, Adolf Hitler, who came to prominence through National Socialism because of this mess that we created after World War I. So one of the great things that we learned was after World War II, we did things differently and created what was modern Europe. And so that was one of the positive outcomes, is we learned how to end a war properly. When I was a boy, I used to spend my summers in York, Pennsylvania with my aunt and uncle there. And I can remember one summer I was having a fight with my cousin about what war was the best. Was World War I better or was World War II better? And I remember my uncle chastising us both and telling us there's no such thing as a good war. Neither war is better than the other war. And there's no better example of that than World War I. The loss of life was staggering, and a whole generation of European men was lost. And but on this Memorial Day, what I really wanted to do was to think about our veterans from 100 years ago that we don't normally think about. The effort and the sacrifices that they made, that was surely a terrifying war. They were going overseas for the first time, seeing things that they couldn't imagine. And in just a few months, they ended this most terrible conflict in human history, probably. And so those veterans had a great sacrifice. They changed the war. They kind of they started America out on the American century, the 20th century. And life around the world and our country would have been much worse were it not for the sacrifice of those veterans. So I just want to thank them, not only them, but all veterans, those in the audience today who have served over the centuries our great country. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your support of our troops, and God bless America.
And as is tradition, we have our bagpipe medley with Rob Wise.
That was Robert Wise, and that's my honor. Introduce Megan to play tag.